This episode of New Politics was released on the 30th of August, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to our audience and welcome to you, David.
Thanks, Eddie. Great to be here. How's your week been?
Oh, my week's been fantastic. And as usual, there's a lot coming up in politics this week. There's a new housing policy that was announced by the federal government. We discussed whether it will work or not. The Iranian ambassador has been kicked out of Canberra and no one can work out why this has happened. And the continuing climate change wars within the coalition that no one really seems to care about anymore. And so lots of excitement this week, and all of this is coming up in this very exciting episode of New Politics.
And I can't wait. Let's go.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
And that is why we're bringing forward our proposed expansion of the 5% deposit scheme to the 1st of October, bringing it forward by 3 months, because we're absolutely determined to do everything we can to fast-track home ownership, fast-track improved number of rentals, fast-track social ownership of homes as well. We want to make a difference as we target our 1.2 million homes objective with our $43 billion Homes for Australia plan. During the election campaign, we said this would make a difference. What we're doing as well is expanding the scheme so that everyone will be eligible, and we're increasing the amount in which it can apply as well to reflect average home prices, in which vary, of course, around our states and territories.
Housing is back in the headlines with the federal government announcing its new 5% deposit home ownership plan for first home buyers, set to begin in October, and that's 3 months earlier than it was previously scheduled. But it's not really that new because it's a Labor program that has existed for some time. There's a few amendments here and there, and it's being repackaged as a new program for political reasons, I guess. And this is what governments tend to do these days. Scott Morrison was very good at doing this, announcing and re-announcing the same old programs. And it's probably the only recycling program that the Liberal Party was actually interested in. And Parliament did return this week, David, and governments always try to find an issue that they can use to set the agenda earlier on in the week and fill the media cycle up as well. And what better way to do this than bring in an old program, freshen it up a little bit, and then announce it as a solution. But the problem is that housing affordability isn't just about getting the housing deposit. And without addressing supply issues, this scheme could actually make things worse by pushing more buyers into the housing market, and the likely outcome is going to be more upward pressure on prices and making them unaffordable. So while this headline might seem good, that idea of people buying a house with just a 5% deposit, the reality is that unless we do something about zoning, unless we do something about planning issues and about construction costs, well, this program might not do very much at all. And the other factor to take into account is that these policies are politically successful, and that's why governments really love them. And ultimately, they're an economic disaster in the long term. And it's just another example of governments creating problems or adding to problems that we'll all have to try and resolve at some point in the future.
When the Howard government brought in the first home buyers scheme, where I think you got $8,000 to go towards your deposit, and really all it achieved was house prices went up $8,000 overnight, back when that made a difference to housing. And it meant that people with more borrowing power could add that $8,000 and then add on the top of that. So it kept people on the lower end of the scale out of the housing market. Now, its supporters would say it wasn't really meant to do that. We can blame greedy real estate agents, or we can blame greedy homeowners who abuse the system. And that may well be true. Hello to all our real estate agents listening, and hello to all our wealthier homeowners listening. I'm not including everybody in that. I'm just using examples as to how they were blaming the system failing, or at least not working as well. Ultimately, money, direct cash at the beginning of the process won't solve these problems. It seems to me that the best thing to do is to start to build public housing, which doesn't affect house prices at all. It might flatten them a bit as people struggling to get into the market think, oh, this is a better alternative. We can at least move into public housing at least for a couple of years while we get our stuff together, or we can move in there permanently, depending on society's attitude towards public housing. It seems that they've watched too much Utopia and looked at it as a documentary rather than a satire by just re-announcing. You can see the Jim character walking into the department saying, mate, I've got a better idea here.
But it just doesn't seem like there's any creative thinking that goes on behind this. And that to me seems to be a big problem too.
Yeah, I do think that the inordinate amount of home ownership amongst our parliamentarians is a problem.
Oh, but even still, it gets back to the idea of those creative solutions. And sure, there's no issue at all about wanting to own a home, but it's just how that's all distributed amongst the population. And supply does seem to be a big problem. And the way that government is involving itself within the housing sector, that's a big problem as well. And there always has to be room for the government to be involved in this area because they're the ones that develop policy and laws about all of this sort of stuff. But when you cut the level of deposit to own a home without lifting supply, that just seems to be a recipe for a disaster. And in other parts of the world, and they don't even have to do the creative thinking themselves, they can actually see the problems that this has been caused in other parts of the world. Because in other parts of the world, the UK had a Help to Buy program, and I think the Australian one might actually have the same title. But in many cities, it pumped up demand in a tight market over there and mainly lifted prices of newly built homes. And of course, that helped developers, while first home buyers kept on chasing higher prices that they never seemed to be able to reach. And Canada also tried share equity and loan deposit incentives, and the take up there wasn't that great. Affordability didn't improve, and prices surged way ahead of what people could reasonably afford. New Zealand, just across the road or across the water, they also loosened deposit rules and handed out first home grants during a supply crisis, and their prices spiked in 2021, 4 years ago, and that caused further problems when interest rates rose over there. And then, of course, we've got the most extreme of extreme cases with the subprime market crash in the US in 2009, which that was caused by easy credit and tiny deposits as well. And it wasn't just the home buyers that suffered over there. The entire world community almost crashed. And I'm not suggesting the government shouldn't do anything at all, but it just needs to be carefully calibrated within a range of policy settings. And we also have to look at who benefits from all of this. In the short term, it might be the first home buyer who gets that home, but essentially in the long term, it's existing owners, not the home buyer, or the people who are still struggling to purchase a home. It ends up being a problem for them too. And ultimately, it's because of these restrictive planning issues at the local council and state level, low density issues, slow approval processes. And in New South Wales, I realise that the state government is working on some of these issues, but it's just not happening quickly enough. And they do say that Rome wasn't built in a day, and nor was Sydney, of course, but all of these issues will take a long time to resolve. But I'm just not sure if the right policy settings are in place at the moment.
It's almost as if the market won't solve every problem because they're trying to bring in a market solution. Yet it's the market that's causing the problem. And the issue is, do you devalue property in which people have paid in loads of capital, loads of interest, and devalue that so that they make a loss to help people coming through? How many people would be prepared to do that? Is it the right thing? Is it fair? And all of those questions we could spend the next four podcasts discussing and not really come up with an answer that will satisfy a lot of people. Do we end up saying, those of you who have ties to the more expensive areas and can't afford it, bad luck. Here's your new house on the outskirts of the city or in a country town somewhere, and force people away from an employer can do that, it seems to me, but I think it's a bit rough to expect population to do that necessarily. And there are incentives to move to the country, at least in New South Wales, I think, where they'll pay you $8,000 moving costs to move to one of the bigger centres. And I believe this has been relatively successful. And because it was on moving costs, it didn't actually affect the price of housing too much, because they'd worked out how much it costs to move and set up the electricity and set up the gas and set up the water and all of that. And it turned out to be about $8,000, and you might get a little bit left in your pocket. So it's not really hitting the house. So prices didn't jump up $8,000 or whatever the price was. Might have been $5,000. But it helped towns that were struggling a little bit, like Bathurst, like Dubbo, like Tamworth, like Lismore, I think Katoomba, Grafton, Griffith, Goulburn, those types of places got a little bit of population boost, and with it, jobs and infrastructure that was needed. It was suddenly justifiable. But that can only work on a voluntary basis, and that can only work if there's jobs out there too. So there was probably public servants and teachers and police officers and health professionals who benefited more than, say, if you were an accountant, tax agent. So, yeah, the housing issue, there's a sense in which we've got to rip the whole thing down. We've got to get the market out of it. We've got to get developers, not development, but developers out of it. We've got to stop developers being able to stand for public office or their friends or their family. We've got to get in smart policy on how do we grow a town? How do we grow a suburb? How do we grow a city? Hack things on so you get a mess like Sydney is at the moment, like Melbourne's going. Do we so overplan it that it's impossible to build anything at all? How do we defend our heritage? The original fabric of the place, where in a developing world where buildings which were once very practical are now impractical. We don't want to knock them down, but we have to think about how do we keep the spirit of them. And the Heritage Act of New South Wales does a pretty good job on that. And I think the rest of the states, I'm most familiar with the Heritage Act of New South Wales, but I think most states find that well. But that tension against vested interests who want to knock down that row of 18, 20 terraces because who wants to live in those? And all this is part of it. And they need to sit down with experts with the profit-driven vested interests taken out. We don't want to hear from the big real estate companies. We don't want to hear from the developers and the dodgy developers. We want to hear from town planners. We want to hear from low-income representatives, low-income people who need housing. We need to hear from architects as well as town planners. We need to hear from demographers, the people who they tend not to listen to, but they're the people that we need to listen to.
Oh, but I think we also always have to be on the constant lookout for alternatives. And I just find this announcement a little bit strange because there was an economic roundtable meeting just last week that the government hosted, and they did talk about some of the ways to resolve the housing crisis during this roundtable meeting. And then the week after, they announced a policy which doesn't really resolve the housing crisis. It probably makes it even worse. And in other parts of the world, you talked about public housing before. Social housing or public housing has actually worked in many cities around the world where they have taken the policy on seriously. And the city of Vienna has invested heavily in social housing, and over 40% of residents live in social housing in Vienna, in Austria. And that's helped to stabilise rents and keep housing prices down. Singapore also tax property speculation and use public housing as a key part of their home affordability system over there. And as a result, Singapore has got one of the highest home ownership rates in the world. And David, a lot of this gets back to what we've always maintained. And we say every time we talk about housing issues or the housing affordability crisis that has been going on for some time in Australia, but housing is a human right and something that you live in rather than something that you invest in and look at the share portfolio and all that sort of stuff. And until governments start making that the priority, whether we have a Labor government or a coalition government, the problems are just going to keep coming up. And until we get a government that's seriously committed to fixing all of these issues up through better solutions and probably better tax reform as well.
The middle classless, Marx might have called them the petty bourgeoisie, those that are more interested in making money than anything else. And I don't mean everyone in the middle class by any standard. It's probably a minority. But that group of people who see money as the be-all and end-all ruin things. And John Howard is the poster boy in Australia. He's not the only one, but he can take the blame. He's big enough and old enough to be able to take it. Hello, John, if you're listening. We've got to soften the effects of money. We've got to realise that money is a tool, it's not even a path. It's a tool. You use money to get things done, and that's its value. It shouldn't be a value in and of itself.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
Australia's just announced it's expelling Iran's ambassador because of Tehran's involvement in 2 anti-Semitic attacks. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says the ambassador will have a week to leave the country. He says Iran's role in funding and directing attacks on Australia's Jewish community is unacceptable.
It was behind the attacks on the Lewis Continental Kitchen in Sydney on October 20 last year, and the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne on December 6 last year. ASIO assesses it is likely Iran directed further attacks as well. These were extraordinary and dangerous acts of aggression orchestrated by a foreign nation on Australian soil. They were attempts to undermine social cohesion and sow discord in our community.
Australia has expelled Iran's ambassador over accusations that Iran is linked to fires at synagogues in Melbourne and Sydney. And this is a dramatic move, David, and it's the first time an ambassador has been expelled from Australia since the Second World War. But it's a move that seems to be filled with so many different contradictions. There was no warning given to the ambassador, and that's something that not usually happens. It always happens. An ambassador is always called in to the government's office or whatever. They're called in to explain themselves or to go through the issue and give their responses to it. This wasn't afforded to the Iranian ambassador on this occasion. There's been no evidence that's been given that creates a link between the Iranian government and these local incidents in Melbourne and Sydney. It's all based on that, hang on, we're from ASIO, so you just have to trust us. But I just wouldn't do that really, because politically and geopolitically, a lot of this just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense for Iran to be engaged in this type of activity in Australia. There's no history of this type of action by Iran in Australia. So why would it all of a sudden start in 2025? And the Iranian community in Australia is around 85,000 people. And most of these people are dissidents who despise the regime in Tehran. And Iran, of course, it does have operatives in Australia who tend to spy on these people. And that's a given. That's what Iran does. It's what China does. It's what Russia does as well. But lighting fires at a synagogue just doesn't seem to make any political sense. It's hard to see how Iran would benefit from any of this. And it also comes in the same way that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said that Australia is not a major player in the Middle East or Western Asia, whichever way you want to call it. And he also said this earlier on in the week to justify his lack of response to the massive pro-Palestine marches all across Australia last weekend, and also his lack of comment on the Israeli bombing of the Nasser hospital just a few days ago that killed 20 civilians, journalists and doctors. So that's what Albanese said during the week to justify his lack of commentary on this, that Australia is not a major player in the region. So if Albanese is saying that Australia is not a major player in the Middle East on the issue of Palestine, well, why does it all of a sudden become a major player when it comes to Iran. And there's also questions about ASIO. And we have to remember that this is the same institution that said that they had seen credible intelligence about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction in 2003. And this led to the invasion of Iraq, which resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people in Iraq. And the only problem there was that Iraq didn't actually have any weapons of mass destruction. So it was all based on a lie. So not sure where they got that information on that occasion, and not sure where this credible intelligence is coming from this time around. So ASIO is politicised, it's incompetent, and it's compromised. And now we're being asked to believe it again 20 years later on another major issue in the Middle East.
It made no sense whatsoever. Now, they've released texts of the people who did it. And the people who did it, who actually set the fire to a couple of synagogues and anti-Zionist synagogue, or non-Zionist synagogues anyway. So that didn't make a lot of sense. Why you would burn down a place that broadly agreed with you when not far down the road there was a place that was not a lot of damage was done. Now, this was explained somewhat by the texts by these ex-bikies who were hired, and apparently they weren't very good at their job, and the text has the ringleader berating them. Now, there's no evidence in the text as to who paid them. Clearly, they were paid by someone to do this, so they were set up as a professional job. It makes no sense that it would be the Iranian government. As you pointed out, they have operatives here. Of course they do. Those operatives are much more interested in finding out what Iranian dissidents are looking at rather than trying to stoke a Cold War with Israel. They've got plenty of opportunity to do that in Israel. Iran has the highest population of Jews outside of Israel in the Middle East too. And then, of course, the really strange one was the Lewis Continental Kitchen in Bondi Street. Now, firstly, no relation. I wish them all the best. I hope that they bounce back from this, but I have no connection with them. He'd burned down a fairly minor food establishment when there were much bigger Jewish-owned businesses around.
Well, also the Revolutionary Guard, they're professionals in this sort of matter. They would have bombed an entire suburb, not just lit a little fire at the door of a synagogue. And I realise that the Assad fire was a lot more extreme than that, but the Revolutionary Guard, this is not their sort of modus operandi. They would blow up the entire suburb.
Yeah. They wouldn't hire...
If they wanted to.
If they wanted to, yeah. They wouldn't hire bikie. It smells like, and I'm not saying it is, but it smells like a false flag operation that the government has totally overreacted to. It's funny, it comes out the week after Anthony Albanese is berated by Netanyahu. The anti-Semitism envoy has been incredibly quiet over this, although I suspect that she's slowly being removed after her outrageous Ambit claims that she didn't see as Ambit claims. As someone who has done a bit of work on the history of intelligence and intelligence organizations around the world, it makes no sense.
And also expelling a diplomat from an embassy, well, that's a serious matter, but it does happen from time to time. But expelling the ambassador, well, that's quite an extreme issue. And it's the first time that it's been done in Australia for over 80 years. And Iran has said that it will retaliate and send the Australian ambassador home as well. And it also, by the way, it also denies all the accusations that have been made against it by the Australian government. And there is that speculation, you referred to it before, David, that this relates to Australia's decision to recognise Palestine at the United Nations in late September, and the Iranian ambassador in Canberra has been quite vocal and supportive of Australia's decision to recognise Palestine, and not sure, or it's not quite clear if that made him a target of all of this, or it might be all about putting pressure on Albanese, as you referred to before, after he made the decision to recognise Palestine, or it might actually provide Albanese with an excuse not to proceed with the recognition of Palestine. And he previously linked the recognition of Palestine when he made that statement a couple of weeks ago, that it's got to be in coordination with the other countries of the region also needing to recognise the state of Israel. And Iran is one of the countries that doesn't recognise Israel, doesn't even recognise its right to exist. And It might be a case where Albanese can now say, oh, well, I was going to recognise the state of Palestine, but have a look at Iran. It's all their fault. I can't support the recognition of the state of Palestine if Iran is behaving in this sort of way against Israel or whatever the case might be. So there's all these other factors that we need to take into account. And before people start accusing us of being conspiracy theorists or wearing our tinfoil hats, I think mine's in the other room, so I might go and get it pretty soon. But you mentioned before, David, Iran actually has the largest Jewish population in the region outside of Israel. It's around 10,000 people now. It actually was a lot more than that before, but that's the size of the Jewish population at the moment. And going back to 1979, and that was at the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, the Ayatollah issued a fatwa to protect Jewish people within its borders. And I'm not suggesting that it's all fine and dandy for Jewish people in Iran, but generally Iran doesn't have a problem with Jewish people per se. It has a problem with the ideology of Zionism and the Zionist cause, and that's what the big issue for Iran is. And that's what makes this link between Iran and these fires at the synagogues in Melbourne and the event in Sydney. That's what makes it also problematic. The Adas synagogue in Melbourne is not a supporter of Zionism. It's not a Zionist synagogue. And Iran attacking a synagogue that is not a supporter of Zionism, well, we've talked about this so many times today, it just doesn't make any political sense at all. None whatsoever.
You can't use intelligence services as a political weapon. And that's what's happening, it seems, with ASIO. You can use the intelligence you get from them as a political weapon, but the intelligence has to be right. It has to be true. It has to be real. It has to be credible. It has to be well sourced. And a professional intelligence agency will do that. And intelligence services hold a very funny position in government. A lot of them are funded through back channel means. A lot of them have branches and sub-branches that never really hit the public eye. A lot of them do act in very, shall we say, extra legal ways. And it's quite extraordinary that, particularly after the weapons of mass destruction debacle, which destroyed the reputation of MI6, destroyed or MI5, which had taken 30 years to build back up after the Philby, McLean, Burgess defections in the 50s. So it had taken 35 to 40 years to build back up to be considered a serious player. It was things like James Bond and Smiley's people and John le Carre who were part of that. And that was totally fiction. And le Carre, who had worked in intelligence, admitted that he changed a lot of the things, partly because he was afraid of breaching the Official Secrets Act, partly because he was writing a novel and had carte blanche to make it more interesting and more palatable to the reader. Fleming had worked in intelligence too, but by the time he'd started writing, he hadn't worked in intelligence for 15 years. So he was writing what he knew, but a lot of it was archaic at the time. Nobody knew that at the time. It was only later when the papers get released that we realized that he was basing it on his own wartime experience in intelligence, which was rather unique anyway. If you're going to have these things, and every country really more or less denies having them, when they have to admit them, like we've all heard of the CIA, we've all heard of MI6, we've all heard of ASIO and ASIS, we've all heard of the French, the Sûreté, etc. They play down, that they just sit in offices and collect data, that's all they do. Of course, there's a lot more that goes on. In some cases, up to sanctioned, if extra legal, assassination. And certainly the people they hired, I don't think had any idea who were paying them. They just were given however much they were given. I suppose $15,000 or $20,000, maybe more, maybe less, I don't know, and told to do this. They then don't do it. Almost certainly they were given impossible jobs too. They burn this stone building down and burn it. Now, they may have thought they were working for Iranian intelligence, but that doesn't necessarily mean to say they were. And they can stand up in court and swear blind and swear honestly and swear truthfully. That's who they were dealing with to the best of their knowledge and belief. They won't get done for perjury. It's all about deniability. It's all about scoring without getting caught. Intelligence works on the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. Everything else is fine, but number 11 is the one that's the best one. They know who the guys who did it are. They'll go to jail, no doubt, unless their handlers are able to negotiate them out of jail. But I think there comes a point where they'll just wash their hands of them.
The other factor is that there's so many people that have been calling this out. So it's not just us wearing the tinfoil hats or being the conspiracy theorists. I haven't come across anyone or hear anyone say, look, believe what ASIO is saying, this is all legit and all that sort of stuff. Maybe I need to get out more often. But the other point is that there's the big double standard that's going on here. And that's the other thing that a lot of people have called out, that we have a situation where the Iranian ambassador is expelled from Canberra based on pretty much no evidence, and based on a situation that for a lot of people seems confusing and doesn't seem to make any political sense. Yet Israel, which is responsible for the deaths of 64,000 Palestinian people at least, and is committing a genocide according to all credible reports, is practicing apartheid and bombing hospitals, as we saw during the week, murders an Australian citizen, Zomi Frankham, that was last year. For all of these actions and all of these activities, doesn't face any sort of diplomatic expulsion, just a few stern words here and there. There's no sanction at all. There's no punishment on the state of Israel, yet Iran is the one that gets punished. So a lot of punishment for Iran, but nothing about Israel. And David, to be honest, when I actually first saw the headline about the ambassador being expelled, I thought, oh, great, it's about time Australia had booted out the Israeli ambassador. But then I realised that, no, it wasn't the Israeli ambassador that they were kicking out. It was the Iranian ambassador. Yeah, I just thought they've made a mistake here. So they ended up getting the wrong guy from the wrong country. And I suppose when Penny Wong actually did say that it's difficult to judge Israel from so far away, well, this is the sort of thing that can happen. You get all the countries mixed up. So that's one issue. And there's also a couple of other anomalies. And some of these issues we might have forgotten about. But ASIO suppressed the nationality of the Avalon Airport hijacker. That's the teenager who tried to hijack a Jetstar plane in Melbourne earlier on this year. We haven't heard too much about that. And I'm sure that if he'd been Arab or Iranian or of the classic of Middle Eastern appearance, we'd know every detail of this guy splashed across the headline. So why have they suppressed the nationality of this particular plane hijacker? We can only guess the reasons there. And then we have the behaviour of the media as well, treating the words of ASIO as the absolute truth. There were no hard questions, no scepticism. There was a little bit of it, but not very much. It's just this blind acceptance of whatever ASIO has to say, and then the government is relaying that as well. And we always have to point to the weapons of mass destruction's debacle back in 2003. If we want to go back further, there's the Hilton bombing in 1978. ASIO got it all wrong at that time as well. And sure, I'll accept that security and intelligence, that's an imperfect science. They're not going to get it right at all times. But if you are going to make these accusations that can lead to unjustified wars, in the case of Iraq, and leads to 200,000 people being killed, or if you're going to make wrongful arrests of people, such as the Hilton bombing, or if you're going to boot out an ambassador for the first time in 80 years, well, you just have to make sure that your information is 100% correct. And I'm just not sure if it is in this case.
Okay, Australia doesn't have a large trade relationship with Iran. And most of the issue of the ambassador is access to flight paths and a bit of tourism and some Australian citizens and dual citizens and things like that. It's not like the New Zealand or the Indonesian embassy. What the three big ones to go to Indonesia, China and the States, I think, where that's very busy and very challenging and there's all kinds of things that are happening all the time. It's not going to do much damage to Iran. It might make it problematic for some Australians over there who are either touring or visiting family or passing through because they want to look at the ancient city of Tehran or what have you. It might make it problematic for Iranian people here, but it just seemed like such a pointless. And again, a couple of anti-Zionist synagogues and a couple of small restaurants that hardly a blow against Zionism and hardly a blow against the globalist Jewish state and all of that propaganda. And again, I really hope that the restaurant bounces back and thrives from this because presumably they've done nothing wrong. And if they are pro-Zionist, the damage they'd have done to the state of Iran from Australia would be negligible, if anything. And I doubt that too. I think if there was real evidence, they'd have released it. Instead, it's just, we know this happened because trust us. Well, we can't trust you. Release the evidence. And not the texts of ex-bikies telling each other how stupid they are. That's been the only evidence so far, which suggests, allegedly, that they were responsible. But it doesn't say who paid for them. It doesn't say who they were dealing with. It doesn't say anything like that. Yet, till we know those types of details, this remains in the area of come off it.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
It's the government's biggest climate policy decision in a decade. The looming question of what Australia's internationally binding 2035 emissions target should be. But for now, all the attention is on the opposition.
What net zero has become is about trying to achieve the impossible rather than doing something sensible.
What did the Prime Minister say about those in poverty? What do you say about those who can't afford their power bills? What do you say about manufacturing leaving Australia?
Too many voters, particularly in our urban centres, could not see themselves in today's Liberal Party. That must change. We must modernise.
Climate policy is political kryptonite for the opposition.
The coalition is in chaos again, and this time it's over the net zero by 2050 policy. And this follows on from a fiery party room meeting in Canberra during the week where MPs are openly at war over what to do about climate policy. And some Liberal MPs want the leader, Sussan Ley, to lock in a 2035 position right now, while the National MPs, backed by Gina Rinehart, of course, are calling for net zero to be dumped altogether. And this follows on from the LNP in Queensland dumping net zero, joining South Australia and Western Australia Liberals dumping the policy as well, and forcing pressure upon the federal Liberal Party. And this is all about something happening in 25 years' time, David. And I realise that you've got to work a pathway towards this, but this is 25 years away, 2050, and you'd think that a competent and professional political party would be able to at least neutralise this issue after it's caused so much political pain over the past two elections, as well as those ongoing climate wars that have been running for them since 2009. But it seems like they're not professional and they're certainly not competent. And now we've got Barnaby Joyce and Michael McCormack from the National Party. They're demanding that all climate laws should be repealed. As far as the coalition policy is concerned, we've got Andrew Hastie claiming that achieving net zero in 2050 will undermine Australia's sovereignty and competitiveness. And there's some in the party that want all of this decided before a comprehensive review of the policy is completed, which is being undertaken by Dan Tehan at the moment. And the Labor government must be having such a good time at the moment. The coalition just wants to keep climate change and energy as a self-inflicted wound and keep destroying themselves over this. And this is the political gift that just keeps on giving for the Labor Party. A divided coalition on climate and energy, no idea about what they're doing and not learning the lessons of two big election losses.
I think it's fair to say, given the rise of the teal independents, that the electorate finds the subject of climate change really important. Everyone who lost their seat to the teal candidates lost it because the electorate preferred the teal candidates' approach to the environment. And the older the pre-teals, like Zali Steggall and Helen Haines, also are very committed to stopping the effects of climate change. The Greens, consistently high in numbers, if not in seats. Why the Liberal Party is trying to ignore it, I'm not quite sure why. The first thing they should have done was say, we have to change our opinion on climate change. Now, I'll be fair, Sussan Ley has maybe suggested that perhaps it's not a bad idea to maybe look at this stuff a bit down the track when things have settled down a bit, perhaps. Not quite committing to it, but certainly making noises towards it. But the National Party, some of them are saying, yeah, look, our constituent members, mostly farmers, are struggling because our once-in-a-100-year rainfalls are coming now every 6 months or so, and it's gone past the stage where who cares how it was formed. We all know that it was probably anthropomorphic. But if it is just the natural thing, we still have to try and work out how to adjust
Of course we
things
do. And the other thing
to
is that if
slow it down.
Sussan Ley can't hold her party together on climate change issues, there's going to be that question about whether she can really survive as a leader for the next few months, let alone the next 3 years. And there's been all sorts of pressure coming in from Conservative quarters. Sky News has been campaigning for her removal pretty much ever since the day that she became the leader just a few months ago. And I think this is quite telling because the Liberal Party does seem to be the political wing of Sky News and News Corporation. There's also the question that if Sussan Ley goes or removed somehow, well, who's going to replace her? Because the Liberal Party isn't exactly brimming with very much talent at the moment. And plus, there's not many of them. There's 27 MPs or whatever it is at the moment. And it just seems like there's some very impatient people within the Liberal Party. And this is some very weird sort of self-sabotage that's going on. Why not just keep quiet, let Dan Tahan review the climate change policy, let all of that play out, and then just see what happens after that? But they just can't wait for that. And instead we've got National MPs attacking this with a sledgehammer pretty much. And maybe because of that smaller gap in parliamentary numbers between the Liberal Party and the National Party, well, the National Party is not really a small junior partner anymore. And sure, it's got less seats, but it's not as small relative to the Liberal Party that it used to be. And while all of this is going on, corporate Australia has pretty much moved on. The business sector signed up to net zero policies years ago, and more than anything else, they just want to see some kind of certainty on climate change policy and on energy. And I think they're starting to get that now. And the coalition is supposed to represent the political interests of the business community, but coalition MPs, they just want to keep fighting this battle that the private sector abandoned a long time ago. And I think this ends up being definitely in the Labor government's advantage. And it's not just about the astronomical numbers, the difference that exists in the number of seats, and that's 94 seats for the Labor government and 43 seats for the coalition. It's about the political performance and the chaos that comes out of this. And the coalition just keeps looking totally unelectable, and it's a problem that isn't going to go away.
You'd have to think, and again, I'm no fan of the National Party, but you'd have to think that the smarter ones in it are going to get worried that they're not going to be in government again, that they've spent their lives working towards the cause, that they looked at their heroes, men of substance like Tim Fisher and Earl Page and John McEwen, who did their very best and added substance to public debates, and who no one ever doubted their zeal for doing the best for Australia, particularly their constituencies, to look at the rabble that it's become and think, why would I bother with these guys? Andrew Gee, of course, won the seat of Calais quite comfortably. Now, he'd come out of the National Party, so he had a fair bit of natural support, but he was the only person to win a national seat. They could look at the record and say, look, we performed on a voting per head basis a lot better than the Liberal Party. Why should we be in coalition with you bunch of amateurs? But there's going to be the point where they're going to look at it and say it's not worth the electoral damage of being with these people.
There's also the Gina Rinehart factor that is a big part of the coalition's climate wars. And I think Gina Rinehart might actually be a 5-star general of that war. She's leading it from the front, but it's a bit like being a general in the Second World War. That all ended a long time ago, or maybe a little bit like those soldiers stuck in tropical jungles thinking that the war was still going on 10 years later. I think Gina Rinehart is a little bit like that, but it's her money and influence, well, especially for the National Party, that's making them harden their anti-net zero positions, even though most of the mining industry has already moved on from these climate wars. I don't know if Hancock Corporation has, but most of the other mining industry has moved on. And I think it's a bigger issue that the coalition is still not getting. I think we talked about it last week. We talk about it quite frequently on New Politics, but this endless obstruction and negativity is just not going to get them back into office anytime soon. And you'd think they would have learned their lessons from the 2025 election. After the heaviest defeat in political history, you'd think that they'd understand that blocking climate action is political poison. And to win the urban seats that they've lost in 2025 and in 2022, and to get back into office, they have to support action on climate change. And if they disagree with those methods, well, they should come up with different methods. But this whole idea of just dumping net zero by 2050, that's madness. And even if they don't believe in this sort of stuff, at least they have to make it look like they do. That's the nature of politics as well. And all of these arguments about climate change policy, and they're actually still bringing up nuclear energy as well, even though that was comprehensively defeated at the 2025 election. It just shows that they're not serious about getting back into government. And if they can't sort this sort of stuff out, well, they don't actually deserve to be anywhere near government.
They want to be in government. They just don't want to govern. And I think they want to carve it up, rot it out, make sure that they can kick into their enemies and perceived enemies, kick into the weak, but not actually achieve anything. Because at the end of 9 years, there was very little achievement. The Turnbull government was dragged kicking and screaming to same-sex marriage. But really the overwhelming policy results, apart from that, which was a very good one, was robo-debt, an illegal system, and was said to be illegal before they implemented it. Scott Morrison is desperately trying to rehabilitate his reputation. How do you rehabilitate a murderer, which is essentially what happens with robo-debt? How do you rehabilitate the degradation of a country that should be much wealthier than it is? Now, admittedly, it's still a wealthy country, but it should be much wealthier. And they just don't understand that. It's an inability to look beyond their own privilege. I really think that politicians should do 2 terms and be thrown out with no money, no job, no contacts, and then come back and do another term and see how things change.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.